Rain streaked down the tinted windows of the town car as Marcus Johnson stepped out into a driveway longer than the block he grew up on. Marble columns rose in front of him, gold light spilling from windows 3 stories high. He had guarded warehouses and strip malls for 6 years. He had never once set foot inside a house like this. A staff member in a black suit led him through a side door without a word, up a private staircase, and left him standing outside a bedroom with instructions that made no sense. Wait here, don't knock, don't leave. Then the door opened. Isabella Rossi stood in the doorway, barefoot, her hands trembling against the doorframe. Her eyes were red, her breath uneven, like she'd been crying alone for hours and had only just remembered how to speak. "Sleep beside me tonight," she whispered. "I'll pay you anything you want." Marcus almost laughed. It sounded like a joke, or a trap, or the opening line of trouble he didn't need. But then he saw it, the real fear behind her eyes, raw and unmistakable. She wasn't flirting, she wasn't negotiating. She was begging. And every guard in the house had already been told to disappear. Before we find out why, if stories like this pull you in, go ahead and hit subscribe. It genuinely helps the channel keep making them. Now, back to that hallway. Marcus Johnson had learned a long time ago that dignity didn't pay rent. He worked the night shift as a security guard at a shopping plaza on the east side of the city, walking the same 3 floors every night, checking the same locked doors, watching the same empty parking lot fill with rain. He was 34, a former Army sergeant who had spent 4 years overseas and 11 years since trying to build something steady out of nothing. His mother, Dorothy, had a weak heart and a stack of medical bills that grew faster than his paycheck. He was 2 months behind on rent. His landlord had already mentioned eviction casually, like it was small talk. He didn't complain, he didn't beg. He just worked. Across the city, in a world Marcus had never been allowed to imagine, Isabella Rossi lived behind gates that locked automatically at nightfall. She was 26, the only daughter of Vittorio Rossi, a man whose name controlled half the shipping contracts moving through the harbor. Isabella had chandeliers, a wardrobe larger than Marcus's apartment, and a car worth more than his mother's hospital debt combined. She also hadn't slept through a full night in 6 years. Her mother had died in a car accident when Isabella was 20, an accident the police report called mechanical failure, and one Isabella had never believed for a second. Since then, sleep had become something violent for her. Her mind wouldn't let go of the dark. She would wake up gasping, certain someone was standing over her bed, certain the walls of her own home were closing in. Doctors had given her pills. Pills didn't fix fear that came from inside a family, not from outside it. That night, a private security firm had called Marcus in on short notice extra coverage for a private event at the Rossi estate, they said. Nothing more. He assumed it was routine. What he didn't know was that the request had been quietly steered through a side channel by Salvatore Rossi, Vittorio's younger brother, not because Salvatore had any plan built around Marcus specifically, but because he wanted a stranger inside the house that night. Any stranger. Someone with no loyalty to the family, no reason to stay quiet if a story needed telling later. Marcus was simply the man who happened to answer the call. Marcus arrived just after 10. The party downstairs was loud, restrained, dressed in black suits and diamond earrings. Nobody noticed when Isabella slipped away from the noise. Nobody noticed when her breathing started to shake, when her hands curled into the doorframe of her bedroom, when the panic that had haunted her for years finally broke loose in full force. Nobody, except Marcus, who heard something through the hallway that didn't belong at a party, a sound like someone trying not to scream. He found her on the floor of her room, back pressed against the wall, eyes wide open, but somewhere else entirely. He didn't think. He knelt down the way he used to when panic hit soldiers, half a world away, low voice, steady hands, no sudden movement. "You're okay," he said. "You're okay. I'm right here." It took almost 10 minutes before her breathing slowed enough for her to look at him and actually see him. That was when she said it. "Please," she whispered, gripping his sleeve like it was the only solid thing in the room. "Don't leave. Sleep beside me tonight. I'll pay you anything you want." Marcus pulled back. Ma'am, I think you need your family, not a stranger. They're all downstairs, she said. They don't hear me. Nobody hears me except tonight, because of you. Her voice cracked. Please, just one night. I'll pay whatever it costs. I just need to know someone is awake beside me. He refused. Twice. 3 times. It wasn't right, not professionally, not personally, not in a house that clearly ran on rules he didn't understand. He stood up to leave, but she didn't let go of his sleeve, and her eyes weren't the eyes of a woman playing games. They were the eyes of someone who had spent years drowning quietly in a house full of people, and had finally found, by pure accident, someone who didn't look away. He thought of his mother's hospital bills. He thought of the eviction notice folded in his jacket pocket. And he thought, strangely, that money had never once bought him this. The sight of someone that afraid, asking for nothing but presence. One night, he said finally, "That's it." She exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for 6 years. He sat in a chair beside her bed until she fell asleep, truly asleep, for the first time in longer than she could remember. He told himself it would end there. He told himself the money would cover his mother's bills, the debt would clear, and by morning this strange, gilded nightmare of a house would be behind him for good. He was wrong. Morning would not end anything. It would only be the beginning. Morning came pale and quiet through the tall windows. And for the first time in years, Isabella Rossi woke without gasping. She lay still for a moment, disoriented by the strange calm in her own chest, before she remembered why. Marcus was still in the chair beside her bed, asleep sitting up, his arms crossed, his jaw tight even in rest. She didn't wake him right away. She just watched him, the way you watch something you're afraid will disappear if you look away too long. When he did wake, stiff and startled by the daylight, she was already sitting up, hands folded in her lap. "You stayed the whole night," she said, like she still couldn't quite believe it. "Said I would. Most people don't keep that kind of promise." He didn't answer that. He stood, ready to leave the way he'd planned, ready to collect whatever payment had been arranged and disappear back into his own life. But Isabella asked him to stay again, not for one night this time, but for as many nights as it took her to feel safe enough to sleep without fear clawing its way back in. The number she offered him made the eviction notice in his pocket feel like a bad joke from someone else's life. He should have said no. He said yes, instead, telling himself it was about the money, about his mother's medical bills, about surviving one more month. It wasn't only that, and some part of him already knew it. Over the following weeks, Marcus learned the shape of the world behind the Rossi gates. It was nothing like the mansion party suggested from the outside. Guards rotated in strict, silent shifts. Every hallway had rules nobody explained out loud. Certain doors were never to be opened. Certain names were never to be spoken at dinner. He noticed the way staff lowered their eyes when Vittorio Rossi walked past, the way conversations died the moment his brother, Salvatore, entered a room. Isabella began to talk to him in the quiet hours before sleep, not about the business, never about the business, but about her mother, about the crash that took her, about how everyone in the family said it was an accident, and how Isabella had learned, the hard way, that in a house like this, the word accident was often just a costume for something else. "I don't feel safe here," she told him one night, staring at the ceiling. "I haven't felt safe in this house since the funeral." "Then why stay?" "Because leaving means admitting I can't trust my own family. And once you admit that, there's no going back." Marcus didn't have an answer for that. He just sat with her until her breathing slowed, until the fear in the room quieted enough for sleep to take her. It became a rhythm between them, not romance, not yet, but something steadier than either of them expected. A kind of healing neither one had asked for, but both of them needed. Then, 3 weeks in, Marcus overheard something he wasn't meant to hear. He'd stepped out for air near a service hallway when he caught 2 of the household guards speaking in low, careful voices about the girl's condition and how it would matter soon in front of the others. One of them mentioned Salvatore's name. The other told him to keep his voice down, Marcus didn't understand it fully that night, but the pieces started falling into place over the days that followed. Isabella wasn't just a woman haunted by grief. She was a piece on a board she didn't know she was playing on. Salvatore Rossi had spent years positioning himself to take control of the family's operations. The one obstacle in his path wasn't ambition or loyalty, it was optics. Vittorio's grip on the organization depended on appearing unshakable, in control, capable of protecting his own house. Isabella's panic attacks, her sleepless nights, her fragile public appearances, all of it, quietly fed to the right people, became evidence that Vittorio could no longer keep his own family stable, let alone an empire. An outsider spending nights in the daughter's room, whispered about in the right circles, would only sharpen that picture. That had been the entire point of bringing a stranger into the house at all. Instead, Marcus had done the opposite. He had steadied her. And a steady Isabella was worth nothing to Salvatore's plan. When Marcus finally told her what he suspected, sitting across from her in the low lamplight of her room, she didn't look surprised. She looked exhausted, like she'd already halfway known and had simply been waiting for someone else to say it out loud. "My mother found out something about him," she said quietly, "before she died. I don't know what. I was 20. Nobody tells the daughter anything." She looked at her hands. "But I remember she was scared before that crash. Genuinely scared, not careful. Scared. You think he had something to do with it?" "I think," she said, "that if I say that out loud in this house, I'll disappear the same way she did." The conversation changed everything between them. This was no longer a story about a lonely woman paying a stranger to keep the dark away. It was a story about survival, hers. And now, by extension, his. If Marcus walked away, Isabella would be left exposed, the last obstacle in a plan that had already claimed one life in the family. He didn't walk away. Salvatore, sensing that his original plan had failed, shifted tactics quickly and without mercy. First came the money, an offer delivered through an intermediary, 3 times what Isabella was already paying Marcus, in exchange for him simply disappearing from the estate and never returning. Marcus refused without hesitation, which seemed to surprise the man who delivered the offer more than it surprised Marcus himself. Next came the threats, quieter but sharper. A car followed Marcus home one night, close enough that he memorized its plates before it peeled off into traffic. A visit was paid to the hospital where his mother received treatment. Nothing overt, just a man asking careful, pointed questions at the front desk about Dorothy Johnson's son that made the staff uneasy enough to call Marcus directly. Then came the lies. Whispers reached Vittorio that the outside guard hired for one night had overstayed his welcome in his daughter's bedroom for reasons that had nothing to do with her health. Marcus was called into Vittorio's study, questioned coldly, dismissed with a warning that his continued presence in the house was being reconsidered. Isabella fought for him in that room in a way Marcus never saw directly but heard about, later refusing to let her father remove the one person who had given her real sleep in years, refusing to explain herself to men who had never once asked if she was okay. Still, the pressure mounted. Marcus, exhausted and afraid of what his presence might cost, the people he cared about, his mother most of all, decided more than once that leaving was the responsible thing to do. He would pack his bag in his mind on the drive to the estate, rehearse the words he'd say to Isabella, tell himself this was the night he'd finally walk away for good. And then he would find her curled against the headboard, shaking, whispering that she'd heard footsteps in the hall that weren't there, and every rehearsed word would die in his throat. He couldn't leave a person mid-collapse. He never had been able to. The breaking point came on a night thick with early autumn rain. Isabella had insisted on attending a family dinner downstairs, a rare appearance meant to reassure the extended family that she was stable, capable, fine. Marcus waited near the east wing, as arranged, ready to walk her back upstairs once the dinner ended. It never got that far. 3 men Marcus didn't recognize intercepted her in a side hallway before he even heard the commotion. By the time he reached her, she was already being dragged toward a service exit, one hand clawing uselessly at the doorframe, eyes locking onto his for one terrified second before a hand clamped over her mouth. Marcus fought. He fought harder than he had in years, taking down one man before a second slammed something hard across his ribs, and a third drove a fist into the side of his skull, hard enough to blur the room into static. He hit the floor. He heard tires screech somewhere beyond the walls. He heard Isabella's muffled scream cut off entirely. Then nothing. He woke hours later on a hospital cot with cracked ribs, a concussion, and a silence in his chest louder than any pain in his body. Isabella was gone. No ransom note. No confirmed location. Nothing but a story quietly circulating among the family that rival interests had taken her to send a message about disputed shipping territory. A story engineered, Marcus would later understand, by the one man clever enough to make his own crime look like someone else's. A day passed with no word. Then a second. Marcus sat in a borrowed room inside the estate, staring at his bruised hands, replaying every moment he could have done something differently. He had promised her, without ever saying the words out loud, that he wouldn't leave her exposed. And in the one moment that mattered most, he had been on the floor, useless, while she was carried out a door he hadn't thought to guard. He believed, in the quiet, brutal way exhausted men believe things at 3 a.m, that this was his failure entirely. That whatever happened to her now, he would carry for the rest of his life. He had nothing left to lose. And as the second day bled into the third, that made him dangerous. By the third day, Marcus stopped waiting for someone else to find her. He tracked down Reyes, a longtime guard on the estate's staff who had always kept his eyes down and his mouth shut, and cornered him in an empty stairwell with nothing but the weight of those 72 hours behind his voice. "You know something?" Marcus said. "I've watched you flinch every time Salvatore's name comes up. Tell me now, or I go straight to Vittorio and let him wonder why you never said a word." Reyes broke. He'd been with the family since before Isabella's mother died, and he'd carried the truth of that night for 6 years out of fear, not loyalty. He told Marcus everything: how the accident had been arranged, how Salvatore had used a rival's name to cover his tracks then, and how he was using the exact same cover now. Isabella wasn't being held by rival shippers. She was being held in a property Salvatore owned under a shell company 2 counties north, waiting to be recovered by his own men in a staged rescue that would make him look like the family's savior in front of the entire organization. Marcus didn't go to the police. In this world, the police weren't the ones who could actually save her. He went to Vittorio directly, laid Reyes's confession on the table along with the bruises on his own ribs, and watched the old man's face change from grief to something colder and far more dangerous. "If this is true," Vittorio said quietly, "my brother didn't just take my daughter, he took my wife from me first." "Then let's finish this together," Marcus said. "Not for territory, not for the business, for her." What followed wasn't a shootout or a spectacle. It was quieter than that, and far more surgical. Vittorio called an emergency meeting of the family's inner circle, the same room Salvatore had planned to use to present evidence of Isabella's instability and Vittorio's failing grip. Except this time, Vittorio arrived early, with Reyes beside him, and with Marcus standing just inside the door, still bruised, still standing. When Salvatore walked in, expecting to stage his triumph, he found the room already turned against him. Reyes repeated his confession in front of the men whose respect Salvatore had spent years courting. Vittorio didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply asked his brother, in front of everyone, where his daughter was being held. Salvatore's calm didn't crack right away. He denied it, calmly, the way a man does when he still believes he can talk his way out of anything. But when Vittorio placed a photo of the shell company's property records on the table, taken from records Marcus had helped Reyes pull that morning, something in the room shifted permanently. The men who had once feared Salvatore's ambition now saw only a man who had orchestrated the death of the family matriarch and the disappearance of her only daughter to seize power. There was no vote needed, no debate. Vittorio gave one order, and Salvatore was removed from the room by the same men who had once answered to him. Marcus didn't wait to see what happened next inside those walls. He was already moving, already in a car, with Vittorio's men heading north, chest aching with every breath, mind fixed on one address and nothing else. They found Isabella in a locked room on the second floor of an unremarkable farmhouse, guarded by two men who surrendered the moment they realized the balance of power had already shifted back in the city. She was pale, exhausted, her wrists raw from restraints, but alive. When Marcus stepped through the doorway, she didn't scream or cry out. She just stared at him like she was afraid he was something her mind had conjured out of desperation. "You came," she whispered. "Told you I would," he said, crossing the room in 3 steps and pulling her carefully into his arms, mindful of his ribs, mindful of nothing else in the world except the fact that she was breathing. Warm, real. She cried then, finally, the kind of crying that comes after years of holding something in. Marcus held on and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say that mattered more than simply staying. In the weeks that followed, the truth about Salvatore's role in the death of Isabella's mother became impossible to bury. Stripped of position, disowned by what remained of the family's loyalty, he disappeared from the organization entirely, his ambitions buried under the same lies he'd used to build them. Vittorio, humbled and hollowed by how close he'd come to losing everything that mattered, began rebuilding something quieter around his daughter. Fewer galas, fewer strangers in the house, more nights where the halls actually felt safe. Isabella's recovery wasn't immediate. Trauma rarely leaves on a schedule, but something had changed at its root. She no longer needed someone paid to sit beside her bed out of obligation. She had someone who stayed because he chose to, night after night, long after any money had stopped changing hands. Marcus's mother's medical bills were paid in full within the month, not from ransom money or family payoffs, but from a position Vittorio insisted on giving him, one with a title that had nothing to do with guns or shipping lanes and everything to do with keeping his daughter safe in the ordinary daylight hours too. Months later, on an evening with no crisis waiting behind it, Isabella fell asleep beside Marcus without a single tremor in her breathing, without once reaching for his hand to make sure he was still there. He noticed. He didn't wake her to point it out. He just watched her sleep, peaceful for the first time since he'd met her, and understood that this, not the money, not the title, not the danger they'd survived together, was what she had been asking for from the very first night. Someone who stayed, not because they were paid to, and not because they were afraid to leave, but because leaving had simply stopped being an option. In the end, it hadn't been the man willing to die for her that saved Isabella Rossi. It had been the man willing to stay through every threat, every lie, every reason the world gave him to walk away, who never left again. If this story stayed with you, let us know in the comments which moment hit hardest, and subscribe if you want more stories like this one. See you in the next one.